Do you do a lot of podcasts? I saw that you've done a few.
I've done quite a few podcasts, YouTube channels, radio, I say no to pretty much, yes to pretty much everything. So I've done quite a few.
Oh, nice. That's kind of a good way to get the word out about monsters, right?
Yes, exactly.
How did all of this start for you? You're kind of living every kid's dream or nightmare, talking about monsters all the time.
It's a dream for me, I will say that. I've been a big fan of horror since I was a little girl. Some of my earliest movie memories are watching, some kind of B-list horror and spooky stuff and consuming the kid horror stuff, like scary stories to tell in the dark, before I jumped into Stephen King, probably when I was in middle school, I think, and my love of horror really just was something I didn't think I could actually make a career until I went to college and had some amazing professors who, helped confirm what I always knew to be true, is that horror has meaning and monsters have meaning. And yeah, I've been just really lucky to be on this journey so far since then.
And if you want a good introduction to horror, I mean, Stephen King is hard to beat.
Oh, yeah, the best. I've read pretty much everything he's written, and Richard Matheson as well was one of the first, kind of sci-fi horror adjacent adult texts I remember reading. So yeah, they're definitely those two are foundational. And Octavia Butler, when I was a little bit older, also getting that female perspective, just really helped shape my love for horror in a lot of ways.
I think my big introduction, I had an older sister. I have an older sister, and she loved horror movies growing up, and so she would force my dad to watch them. And I would occasionally get to stay up late on a Friday or Saturday night, and I would watch them with them and just get completely scarred. I was way too young, but that's all part of the fun. And
that is part of the fun.
Yeah, that's what you have to do. You have to go through that and then realize things are going to be okay. It's not as bad as it seems. But there was one about the Tooth Fairy that probably messed me up for a little bit, about how the Tooth Fairy, it was based in a lighthouse, and this guy woke up when he was a child and saw the Tooth Fairy, and the lore was that you can't see the Tooth Fairy, otherwise she tries to kill you. And so he's living in this lighthouse as an adult because that's the only way that he can keep her away, is by having the light go around him, sleeping up there with it. And his girlfriend or something ends up seeing the Tooth. I don't quite remember it. It's an older movie, but I was probably 9, a 9-year-old kid. That was a little traumatic.
That's so funny. I remember there was a Disney Channel movie, which I'm sure is not scary at all, that scarred me. And it was about the boogeyman. And I remember talking in the movie, the way you protect yourself from the boogeyman is you keep your covers over your head. So between that and all the vampire stuff I was consuming, for a very long time, I would sleep with my covers like completely over my head, with just like a little hole to breathe and peek out. And I thought that would keep me safe.
That's the trope everybody has, right? You turn the lights off and then you jump into bed and get under the covers, and you're safe from whatever's around or in the closet.
So funny.
So you're a lit major, right, by trade?
I am, yes. I have a PhD in British Romantic Literature with an emphasis on the Gothic. And that's really, again, where my broader study into monsters began. I was writing my dissertation a while ago about representations of the undead in the early 19th century. And that just got me into looking at some really old like folklore texts and exploring things about like the fae folk and other undead beings. And just I really started believing, despite what some other people advised me to do, that this was something that I really enjoyed pursuing. And if anyone who's done any kind of schooling, including graduate schooling, you definitely have to love it, I think, because it's pretty brutal. So I was lucky to find what I loved so quickly. And I pivoted. I've been a professor as well at Arizona State University for over 11 years now, which is crazy. So I've taught a lot of classes, and I love being in the classroom, but I also love something like Monstrum, because I really think a lot of my public scholarship work is accessible, and I intentionally want it to be. I don't think that we need to keep higher education and curious minds from learning stuff behind, paywalls. So partnering with PBS and YouTube has been an absolute blessing in a lot of ways, and it's allowed me to connect with, I say, not just an audience, but millions of students across the globe.
That's how I found you, was through Monstrum, watching your videos, which I must say are really great. I mean, the production value you guys have is incredible there.
Thank you. We are very proud of it. So my production team is Spotson. They're based out of Austin, Texas, and PBS connected me with them when I first pitched the show idea, since they've produced some other really successful shows. And we just instantly clicked. They, shared my creative vision. They understood kind of what I wanted to do with the show. And it really is a labor of love for a lot of us. I research and write every episode and do contribute to some of the creative angle, but it really is a team effort. We have an illustrator based in the UK who's been around, Sam Allen, for forever with us. And then, the rest of my team, we really work together. There's a lot of sitting around at a table before I'm filming, talking about, what we want to do, what angles we want to shoot from, what images we want to include, and just having the show evolve over time with them has been amazing.
How did Monstrum start? Was it just you creating YouTube videos and then you got affiliated with PBS?
So embarrassingly enough, I was not that big of a YouTube consumer before starting this journey. The couple things that I had watched are a lot of like the Green Brothers classics, like Crash Course. And I knew more educational content on YouTube, which I guess makes sense. But I had never produced YouTube content myself. I had done some public scholarship in terms of like speaking at different Comic Cons and doing some in-person events and writing for some online publications, but hadn't really gone into video. Ironically, I also have an undergraduate degree in journalism, and I specifically went with print journalism because I did not want to be on camera. Which is, where
funny how
I am
life
now.
works.
Yeah, it's funny how life works with that. So Monstrum had, again, the idea I had is I was finishing up my PhD and trying to think about future career stuff. And I had some amazing advisors at ASU who it was really interesting. They paired us actually with some marketing and business people. And that was where I'd been introduced to the idea before through journalism, but thinking about my research as a brand. And I think that that's something that a lot of scholars don't want to acknowledge or recognize because it takes away the lowercase r romanticism, from the profession. But I think especially with my personal goals and what I wanted to do, I was like, someone said to me, like, why be the expert on the show when you can be the show? And I had never thought that big before. So I just kind of ran with that idea. I know PBS gave me, I think, like 15 minutes to cold pitch them. I had zero idea what I was doing. I didn't have a pitch deck. I don't even know if I had like a summary. I just hopped on like a Zoom call with the then director of digital studios at the time, Adam, and they were looking for humanities content. They kind of believed in my vision and what I wanted to do. And frankly, I think I was so passionate about this weird niche thing that they were like, okay, why not just, run with it? And again, we're on our 7th season of Monstrum right now, coming up on our 100th episode at some point this year. So what started was maybe meant to be like a one-off is grown into something much larger.
And 100 episodes is no small feat.
No, it's really exciting. And again, I've researched and written almost every single one of them. So for me, it's a lot of work, but I absolutely love that. I mean, I am a researcher by trade and a professor by trade. So that's kind of what I like to continuously learn along with my audience. And I think that, now I've done over 80 or 90 monsters or something from across the world. And I like to tell my students that I just know a lot of random stuff. But luckily other people want to know that random stuff. So I'm lucky.
A good dinner party guest, they would say.
I would hope so. I think so. I know when people say like, oh, wait, you're a monster expert. What's that? And then, there's always a question of, oh, what are you scared of? Do you still have nightmares? Or they'll ask me, about a hot take on like a horror movie or something. And it's fun. And that's, again, one thing that keeps me going back to it and keep doing my public scholarship in Monstrum while I'm also teaching a full course load is I love the sense of community that I really think horror and monsters bring people together in like a really creative and interesting way that's fun. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with Monstrum from the beginning. I remember in that pitch meeting, I know I said, blessedly, I want to do for monsters what Anthony Bourdain did for food. And like just show how have more in common than separate, and to really spotlight different cultures and communities in a way that's respectful of those traditions, but also again learning alongside the audience has been a gift.
Yeah, I heard that quote from you in a previous podcast that you had done, and it really resonated with me because Anthony Bourdain was huge with his cooking shows, with his travel shows, where he's just bringing all of us into this culture while he's just eating food, experiencing it with these people, having great discussions, and kind of opening up a new world for people that might not otherwise get to experience it.
Exactly, and one of the things I do with my research is try to pull from as many different sources and as many different disciplines as I can, and then also bringing in experts, when appropriate and when, feasible with production is we do try to consult with others because I'm not certainly the only voice that should be talking about these things. I just happen to have a platform that hopefully exposes people to be able to consume or do their own research and, find their own voice. And that's one of the most rewarding things that I come across I read every single comment on every single video, which I know is slightly unhinged in a lot of ways, but it's made me a better writer. But what I love to see in the comments is, oh my gosh, I remember this from like my childhood, or thank you so much for, representing this accurately. And just again, helping people share their stories is something that I'm passionate about.
I would imagine you're lucky in the sense that most of the comments are probably positive, right? I can't imagine people are getting too worked up.
You'd be surprised.
Oh, there it is.
I would say they're largely positive. There's always comments about my pronunciation of other words, which we do our best. My production team knows this very well, and sometimes it pops up in the outtakes at the end of the episode that I can't even pronounce a lot of English words correctly. For whatever reason, there's always like one word in the script I stumble over repeatedly. So that kind of stuff is, it is what it is. But largely, I would say the comments are positive, and a lot of the emails that I get from like parents and little kids too kind of offset a lot of the negativity.
I do like that you leave those little blooper reels in at the end as you're kind of wrapping up the video. I enjoy those.
Yeah, we started doing that. I don't remember which season we did, but we figured we might as well because there's always something that, again, I'm doing wrong or making a mistake. Although I will say that sometimes it's harder for them to find the bloopers because I've gotten better at this over time, at least.
And you're like, yes, got that one.
Yeah.
Had you been doing anything monster related in print? I noticed you mentioned Comic-Con. Was that prior to Monstrum?
Yes. So Phoenix Comic Con, I was part of a board of a couple panels or a group that wants to bring like science and education into the Comic Con space. And obviously monsters is a really easy way to do that. So I was talking about things like video games and monsters. I wrote about zombies for Slate magazine. I did at the Tempe Center for the Arts, which is local to where I am. There was actually some panels about monsters, like for an exhibit that they had that I contributed to. So yeah, I was dabbling in some smaller spaces. And then, of course, doing some of the more boring things. I think a lot of people would think like conference presentations and more traditional academic work. But I think that balance is really fulfilling for me. But I also would like to think hopefully inspires other people to truly follow what they want to do with their passions. I definitely was told by some individuals, no one that I worked with at ASU, I will say that, that if I were to continue to pursue like my work with monsters and the undead, that I wouldn't have a career.
In academia.
And yeah. That it was just like too weird and too niche and didn't see the point. And that was, really hard to hear at the time and definitely damaged my ego and my confidence for a little while. But luckily I had, people to offset that in colleagues and, professors who I just doubled down because I'm stubborn. So people are like, how did you get here? And I say, I'm really lucky, but I'm also really stubborn. That I just kind of decided to say, screw it and, screw you. And now I'm doing what I'm doing now, which is absolutely incredible. And, being able to be on some of those network shows that I always dreamed on being on, but also creating my own content about something that I love is encouraging for me.
Yeah, and how wrong was that person? Now you send them an email with a clip saying, oh, yeah, thanks for the bad advice.
Oh my God, yes. If I could find that email.
Frame it on the wall.
Yeah, literally frame it on the wall. And Stephen King famously did that with some of his rejections, right? So I do think that rejection is something that happens obviously to all of us, and we all have setbacks in our career. And not that it's maybe the best advice, but I just dug my heels in and really committed myself to proving those people wrong. And hopefully I have done that.
My favorite story along that line is with Adam Sandler. When he was in college, he had an acting professor that invited him out for a drink and casually kind of told him, hey man, you might want to think about another field because I don't think this is going to work out for you. And then meanwhile, cut to today, and he's one of the greats.
Huge.
Yeah,
exactly. And I've heard so many stories like that from, creators and artists and authors, and just, I remember I'll have students say, like, I've never gotten an A on an English paper before. And I'm like, that doesn't mean you're bad at writing. Like, let's talk about it. Let's figure out your own voice. So I think that it's all about trying to find those mentors and those people who are going to be more encouraging to offset the negativity. But I'm probably overly optimistic about that. There's way too much negativity, though, in the world. And with my viewers and my students, I just try to be honest and transparent and try to encourage them.
Well, you need that. You need that
Yeah.
optimism, and you need that screw it energy where you're not going to take a no and you're just going to keep your head down and keep working. Otherwise, you're never going to try anything and nothing's ever going to work out.
Exactly. And, there's always a lot of obstacles and roadblocks and that. And I just try to give my best advice. I have a student right now who wants to do like law, but doesn't necessarily want to practice law, wants to do like media communication. And like, how can I do both those things? And I talked to her, I'm like, you're already doing it. So just kind of encouraging people. And I don't know, it makes me seem, I guess, cheesy and lame, especially coming from like the scary monster lady. But I think that's one of the reasons. Oh, gosh, I'm so sorry.
Oh, no worries.
That was my little Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode figure, so thematically appropriate. I lost my train of thought. Monsters. Oh yeah, so that's one of the things that drew me to monsters, is that I've always, not always, but I tend to identify with the monster or the thing that's being demonized in a lot of ways. And I know just anecdotally and from some, academic studies that have been performed, a lot of people are driven to horror if they feel like they're marginalized in some capacity. And I do think that there's potential for horror and being scared and monsters to being educational. I mean, I've kind of staked my, my career on that, but I truly do believe it. So I think that finding, I guess, the positivity even in that can be more challenging at sometimes, but again, something that I'm passionate about.
Do you think that stems from just feeling misunderstood, and so you can relate to the monster in that sense?
Yeah, I think it comes from being misunderstood. I think that a lot of the original creators or storytellers of things like folklore and Gothic literature, and even now, yes, they're telling stories that are meant to entertain and sometimes, police cultural values, but there's definitely, again, education in that. And I think that for people, marginalized voices in communities who feel misunderstood, I think the reality a lot of the time is that they might be in actual more physical or emotional danger. So, and I've not going to try not to get too like capital R romantic about this, but this idea of like the sublime and delight. And I do think that there's a cathartic element to horror. And there have been actually scientific studies done on this, that it almost serves as a psychological test or hypothesis that we can, by experiencing fear through this like mediating factor of fiction, that we are able to better prepare ourselves for real life scary things. I know, for instance, for me, I'm not like a prepper by any means, but I've had a go bag, more than one, for years now. Well, really long time, since I was like an undergraduate, a teenager. And that was partially because I was living in Colorado. I was scared of what would happen if my car broke down in the snow. But thinking about putting things in that bag at the time, it's not like I was buying prepper guides. I was watching horror movies and thinking about okay, of course I need a solar powered flashlight, duh, but I'm going to put some little mini bottles of alcohol in there for like sanitizing reasons, but also bartering. And my kind of preparation journey came from horror, not necessarily from more traditional fields.
Oh, how funny is that?
Yeah.
You're watching,
and I'm not the only one. I've heard that from other people as well, which I think is really interesting. So that just proves to me again that I think these scary stories can actually help us. I know something like Contagion. Have you seen the movie Contagion?
I haven't. I've heard that it's a great film. I have not seen it yet.
I really enjoyed it. Obviously came out a long time before the COVID pandemic, but watching that movie after 2020, it's surreal how much was accurate. I know something happened similarly earlier in the 21st century with 28 Days Later, that a lot of those really eerie scenes of abandoned London came after a rash of terrorist attacks that, before the movie was released. And again, not necessarily that Contagion or 28 Days Later were intentionally trying to evoke those things, but it's weird how horror and sci-fi sometimes predict certain things that are going to happen, and frankly, how people respond to those things.
And the crossover there. I mean, when I was looking at photos of LA and it's just deserted, and I was thinking 28 Days Later.
Yeah, I talked about this too in my SCP Foundation, like the Backrooms episodes, where there was this fascination with the back rooms or like these creepy liminal spaces. Again, partially that blew up on social media during 2020 because we were seeing that. We were seeing airports with no one in them. We were seeing office buildings with no one in them. And it's eerie and uncanny to a degree. So yeah, that's part of what my work does, is look at not just the monsters that we're creating at a given moment of time and who's making those monsters. I think that whoever's pointing the finger, actually we could learn a lot about those people from the monsters that they create, but how then we respond culturally to them. Like which monsters stick around, which don't, and why is something that I'm always interested in trying to better understand.
What is your determination there? Do most monsters end up sticking around, or do some actually fade into obscurity?
Some fade, and some are more recent than you would think, too, which I think is really interesting. And again, that's not to say that a monster that randomly pops up and then might be something that's huge. So, spoiler alert, we have an episode coming out about the Beast of Gavaudan, which was sort of a cryptid, but also connected to like werewolves and like maybe real serial murder in, medieval France. And that was something that everyone was talking about at the time globally. And it's, niche thing that you can kind of find a little bit more about on the internet right now. But I think that's an example of something that kind of has like a trajectory and then fades out. But there's always someone like me and my fellow, monster nerds who are trying to dig up those stories. So I think it perpetuates. In terms of which monsters I think determine which ones are going to stick around, I think they have enough mutability, or that they're able to change certain aspects and still be relevant, even as culture and technology change, right? So I think that's one of the reasons something like the undead has seen so many different variations, because death is an inevitable part of life. And I think a lot of us are uncomfortable about what happens after death and what do we do with the bodies and how do we respect the dead. So that seems like something we haven't lost, right? So of course the undead are going to stick around. But I also think it's when something can cross genre is also when it gets to stick around. I know, for instance, with my child, that his room is completely like cute monster themed. There's some really cool presses out there putting out like cuddly cute monster stuff. So to me, that's an example of how something like the Chupacabra can endure, not just because of, the time of its creation, it was really important, but because it's kind of found its way into other forms of media and other genres.
Well, I think Frankenstein's kind of an interesting case there. He's not necessarily a zombie, but he is brought back to life. And that ties back into your idea of it being able to resonate with people, that idea of wanting connection, wanting to be close to people and kind of being shunned for that.
Absolutely. And I think I could talk about Mary Shelley for days, obviously. But I think that with Frankenstein's creature, there is obviously that sort of horror aspect and the sci-fi aspect. But I think one reason too that story has lived on for so long, been galvanized for so long, is because it wasn't just about the monster or the monster's creation, right? It dealt with themes of death and loss and family and education, and was really talking about a lot of things that real people were having conversations about culturally at the time. And again, those things about what does it mean to create life? What does it mean to have a good or a bad parent? What does education look like? How are people treated? Those are common themes that we've dealt with throughout, time, and we're still dealing with. So yeah, if there's the monster, the story's not just about the monster. I think that gives it a little bit more longevity.
It is interesting that it's been branded Frankenstein's monster and not Frankenstein's creature. I kind of picked up that you said creature there.
Yeah, and I think that's because, and I've taught Frankenstein multiple times, and this is something that my students and I always have really good debates about, is who is the actual monster in the story. And a lot of people, at least just anecdotally, will agree, my personal opinion, they both are, right? It's Frankenstein himself is horrific in the way he treats his creation, or his child, essentially, but then the way the creature responds is, horrific as well. So I think that dynamic is super interesting. And yes, I say creature, not monster, because I also identify with Frankenstein's creature. I read that book for the first time when I was an undergrad. And again, I read it a lot about education and the creature trying to understand language and watching other individuals and kind of learning culture from that way. And obviously being thrust into a new community and a new world and coming into adulthood and trying to decide what I wanted to do and what parts of education were valuable to me. I saw myself in the creature. So maybe that means I also have a little bit of monster in me. But I think that so many people feel that way about lots of different monster stories.
And it's kind of relevant today in the sense that, we have these health movements, these pushes, especially with CRISPR for longevity in life. And what is that going to look like as we start pushing the expiration date in some sense of people back a little bit, maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years, and we start sticking around a little longer.
Yeah, and like the biohacking stuff that's going on, and is the science real? Is it not? Like, who gets access to it? We've been telling those stories just with different words and different people for a really, really long time. What is going to happen with that? I think part of it, this is something that I believe we're seeing an increase in like vampire texts, right? That's kind of how a lot of vampires are today. And I think vampires should be scary, for the record, not necessarily like beautiful and sexy.
Not Twilight necessarily.
Not Twilight vampires, but I think there's something very attractive to a lot of people, like you're saying, is that if we want to try to prolong life and beauty and strength, however we're defining that, we have this fictional character that in a lot of ways addresses sometimes the horrors and the brutality that might occur should we go along that route.
Why do you think vampires should be scary? Is that to align more with historical accuracy of it?
Yes. I actually have an episode coming up about this as well. I think that we've seen cycles of sort of scary, sexy vampires, and I have some theories as to why that is. We'll have to wait to the episode to find out. But I do think vampires should be scary, as the original folkloric versions were not like cute or not beautiful. They were, literally walking corpses in a lot of ways. And that, of course, changed over time. But I think there's something so interesting about a grotesque body that, reappears and wants to feed on the life force of another person. And we've seen that in different iterations across different countries and communities. But yeah, I think vampires should be scary. So I'm a big fan. The kind of touchstone I go to a lot is Guillermo del Toro's The Strain. Chef's kiss vampires for me, because they're so creative idea there, but there's something so hideous about them and gross about them, but there's still like this allure or attraction. And I think that's really interesting to explore. But yeah, I like my vampires to be scary and a little gross.
Did you see Nosferatu?
I did.
You want to talk about a scary vampire?
Sure. Yes, a scary vampire. And I actually think that this most recent interpretation of Nosferatu is probably someone's going to drag me for this, the most accurate interpretation of Stoker's original portrayal of Dracula. Not what the movies have shown, and the original Nosferatu does this a little bit as well. But yeah, adding that mustache and just the accuracy of that, of Nosferatu, is something that I really appreciate.
And just making him grotesque in a lot of ways, and then still having that weird sexual element like you were touching on, especially there at the end.
Yeah. I think a lot of that deals with like danger and our attraction to danger in general. And, having this sexuality obviously can be something that's very confusing and hard to understand in a lot of ways. And I think that those kind of vampires address that as well, of like, maybe you're into that thing, but it also makes us question, I think, like, how do we define aesthetic beauty? Because that definition is going to be different for a lot of people.
And there is a weird level of attraction for some to monsters. And if you want to talk about human monsters, serial killers are a big one, where people are sexually attracted to this idea and will write people who are in prison for killing people.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting phenomenon that I explored a little bit in my Audible series, Serial Killers Real and Imagined. So I dove into more of like the culture of this. And again, I'm by no means a psychologist, but at least viewing it from a pop culture perspective and from a historical perspective, I think a lot of that attraction is how they've been portrayed specifically in the media, and how we've developed this, trope of the serial killer, which is actually different from real serial murderers. So yeah, I think there's that danger bad boy element that we can trace back for at least a couple hundred years, if not longer than that.
Do we know how old the oldest monster story is?
So some of the oldest ones that we're aware of come from like ancient Babylonian traditions and Mesopotamian traditions. So something like Tiamat, or Mother of Monsters. But I always think that's a challenging question, because our response is always what we know so far, right? There's still so much that we haven't discovered. And I think what's important to keep in mind too with monster tradition is that I believe we've been creating monsters from the beginning of time, and we just weren't writing them down. They were told, through oral tradition largely. And, it was a rare thing for someone to be able to write, and frankly, for those texts to survive. So I think that we don't even know probably what the oldest monster in the world is.
Yeah. How do you keep track of an oral story passed down?
Exactly. That's why I'm really interested right now. And I think a really cool area is digital folklore, because as a monster scholar, for like the first time, like we know the exact timestamp of something like the Slenderman story was created. And that to me is, again, fascinating because that's so rare in my profession, especially with literature and, trying to find the first text. That I guess that'd be one of the good things about the internet from a folklore historian perspective, is having those timestamps is really fascinating.
And it's almost, Slenderman specifically is almost a weird case study where you would think we have so much more access to information. We have all of these other tools and we're still creating stories of monsters. And they're still incredibly attractive. Slenderman was huge, is still huge.
Like I said, I think that we've always been creating monsters. I think that humans are inherently storytellers, and to tell really good stories, you can't just have all good characters and characters that are all altruistic and like the good guys or the good person, because that's not the reality of the world that we live in. There are a lot of dangers out there, both natural, from other animals, from other people, and from the things that we create in the world and our technologies. So I think we're always going to be creating monsters. How we tell those stories might be different, but I can't see any point in humanity's existence where we're not going to have monsters.
Do you think that these monster stories that we tell are always in pursuit of a lesson or a warning or a cautious tale, or are some of them just something fun to tell?
I think that even maybe at the time of their original creation, they weren't supposed to be a warning, that they oftentimes become that. And the way, again, that people respond to them can sometimes add that meaning. One of the reasons I fought to name the show Monstrum, there was some pushback initially. Monstrum, which is the root word for monster, means a portent or a warning. And I wanted to make sure I was establishing, again, that these aren't just scary stories. So I think it'd be unfair to a lot of the creators of monsters over time to say like, oh, they were trying to, demonize a certain individual or teach a certain lesson. But I also think that maybe even that if that wasn't the original intent, how people responded to it kind of became that. So an example of that would be something like Siren Head. And I had the chance to talk to the creator about that. And, he was telling me that a lot of it was artistic creativity on his point, but he liked to see how that monster evolved over, social media and pop culture, because he just sees that as like a continuation. And again, people telling stories. So I think that's really cool and exciting. And maybe my interpretation of monster is different than someone else's, but I think that probably says a lot about me and my values, right? And like my education and upbringing, all those things that kind of make me who I am. So I think that exploring, again, which monsters survive, how we respond to them is just as important as who created them and why.
And some of that comes back into play for adaptability. If you can attach your societal norms or expectations onto that monster and kind of fit it to that culture.
Exactly. Yeah. And then that helps it exist for longer periods of time.
Do you think Slenderman's going to be around in 100 years? You think that one's here to stay?
No.
Oh, you think it's going?
Think so. I think it's my go. Yeah. I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that people falsely try to, well, it could though, because in the Slenderman story, people have falsely tried to say that it's been around for hundreds of years, right? And like say, oh, here are these woodblock prints of like Slenderman, which are completely fake. So I do think that maybe as technology gets more and more advanced, we see this with like AI and that kind of a thing, that it's going to be harder to maybe tell if something has more history than it actually does. But for me, Slenderman is so rooted in digital culture, but also in this idea of like the men in black and government sort of surveillance, that the shape of that is probably going to change, even if that sort of fear of government surveillance continues.
That was something I learned in your video, was that people were photoshopping older pictures and older text to try to make it seem like he'd been around for hundreds of years.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons for a lot of these episodes, I have to do deep dives into really old text, because I'm trying to, find the origin, as we've talked about. But more importantly, for me, I'm trying to debunk a lot of the stuff that's out there.
I would imagine that's a big portion of it, is just debunking unfactual information.
Yeah, and not just, I'm obviously not just doing research online, but there are, academic texts. We're all human, or we're relying on an academic source that maybe got something incorrect or wasn't able to, read the story in the original German, so doesn't have, exactly the accuracy that we need. So that is one of the largest challenges, is kind of fact-checking everything. But again, that's part of my job, I see it as, that's, one of the things I hopefully can offer, is I'm trying to give the most accurate representation of a lot of these monsters.
Do a lot of stories cross over in the way that Slenderman did, where you had those two girls murder their friend and claim that they were trying to summon him, was my understanding?
Yeah, I think that's a really extreme example of how we do see some of that crossover. Historically, there have been a lot of monsters that caused real people to be, you know, injured, killed, or, treated a certain way that's unfair to them because of these stories. Thinking of something like were hyenas, but also things like werewolves and vampires even. There's no real one source we can say like, oh, all these vampires are being caused by X. But there are definitely instances that we can point to where like this person might have been suffering from an actual, medical condition that made them be treated in a certain way. And I think mental health comes into play with that. I'm thinking of something like changelings and fae folk and this idea that people were being swapped, but even something like possession. So I do think that there is that overlap, but the Slenderman example is extreme, but there have been other extreme examples throughout history. The witch trials would be an obvious one,
that's
and
what I was
werewolf
thinking.
trials.
Yeah,
exactly. Mm-hmm.
And I guess a less extreme example would be the Hat Man, where people are just, waking up from dreams or still in kind of a weird dreamlike state and say that they see this guy in the corner.
Yeah, the Hat Man and sleep paralysis, I think, is really interesting. And I think part of that is because when I was doing my research for the Hat Man, that even the idea of the word nightmare came from some people thinking that this one man's Hat Man was potentially like an actual horse sitting on someone's chest and like restricting their breathing. And we see that with like cats or something like succubi. So that's an example, I think, of how the concept of the monster has lingered because it's linked to something that is real in our experience, but just literally the shape that it's taken has changed over time because of word of mouth, where you first encounter that idea, that kind of thing.
Did I hear that your brother had sleep apnea?
Yes.
In a sense?
Yeah.
Or
my
sleep
brother,
paralysis?
He did. He used to suffer from sleep paralysis, and blessedly, he let me interview him on the show. And he was saying that he's definitely remembers seeing some kind of like shadow figure, and that's how a lot of people describe it. And he said it did appear that it was wearing a hat, but he also acknowledged that he thinks he'd seen something about that previously that kind of influenced the brain. But when I was doing research for that episode, there was something really fascinating that some scientists had speculated, and like neurologists, that part of the shadow person phenomenon that happens with sleep paralysis might actually be attributed to our brains kind of misfiring or not waking up completely, where our concept of self is actually projected outward. And I think that's a really interesting interpretation, that we're not seeing a demonic entity per se, we're seeing an exterior reflection of ourselves and just misinterpreting that. And of course, it's dark. You're terrified already because you're experiencing these physical symptoms.
You can't move.
Exactly. So painting that thing that we're seeing as a negative, I think seems very plausible and natural to some degree.
I had sleep paralysis a few times in my life, in my younger years. And I can remember you feel like a presence or something off in the corner. And I often wonder, had I seen Hat Man, would I have kind of portrayed that on that presence?
Or if you had seen like Slenderman first, or if you had watched a movie of something like It Follows, there's that, what have you been influenced by how does that interpret what you see? And I think that that can be said not just of something like sleep paralysis and the Hat Man and shadow people, but how also other people, human people, are portrayed in horror movies can have an effect on how we respond to certain individuals in the real world as well.
That's an interesting interpretation. I hadn't heard that it might be a self-projection. And you're kind of because again, you're in that weird state where you're like half awake, half asleep still. It's a little murky.
And I think it gets into some like doppelganger fears and like that kind of thing too, of fear of self. And yeah, the Hat Man was a really interesting episode. And again, I get excited about these things because I get to learn so much. And that's what it drew me to academia in the first place, was I just want to keep learning. I love teaching because I feel like in teaching, I'm learning from my students. And with something like Monstrum and exploring all these monsters, I get to learn about things like neurology, or ancient spiritual traditions, or, even things like archaeology and architecture have all popped up, and that just really keeps me inspired to keep doing this. And hopefully that's what Monstrum does, and my larger work is, gets people to look at these stories more critically and hopefully more interdisciplinary and more open-mindedly.
Well, and having a literature background must be helpful because you get to really dive into these stories.
Yes, I get to dive into them, and again, large part of my training with a PhD is how to do good research and how to write. And so both of those things have definitely come in handy. Writing for something like a YouTube show like Monstrum is extremely different for writing for an academic publication. But that's both challenging for me, but also, again, like rewarding and exciting because I get to sort of push myself as a writer and a researcher and a storyteller.
What's your process look like for Monstrum? Are you finding a monster or coming across one and thinking, oh, this would be interesting?
Yeah, largely. Maybe something will pop up in my research or from reading all those YouTube comments, someone maybe suggest a monster and I'll do a little basic research and be like, this seems really weird and specific. And then, I go down like a research spiral where I'm learning about like horses in ancient China and like something that seems totally unrelated, but actually becomes really important. So yes, a lot of it's my own interest or things that are inspiring me. We definitely, again, the production team and I work really well with each other, so they'll pitch ideas as well. We recently started like a formal pitch document where we kind of rate that, but part of it also isn't just the cool story. It's like, what's the thesis or the question that's kind of driving my research, and how could we make that visually exciting for our audiences as well. But so once we decide on the monsters that we're going to shoot, and we batch shoot, so we'll usually shoot 3 episodes at a time, time permitting. So I do travel quite a bit, moving back and forth between Arizona and Texas, but we've got it down to a well-oiled machine at this point. I will start doing the research. So I pop on to library resources and different museums and, access I have to things like 19th century journals, and I'll just start word searching and trying to find what I can and cross-referencing things. And then, I have those weird aha moments where I'm like, this weird thing about the monster seems super specific. Like, what can I learn about the culture at that time? Not necessarily the monster that might be driving it. So I have all my notes. I do the first version of the script, share that with my production team, and then we will probably go through and edit it at least 2 more times before we get to the table read. And then the table read is something that I think is also really valuable and important, and we try to do that when we're literally in the same room as one another to see if things are working, or are we losing interest, because it is different when you're trying to share the story verbally and visually than what you're writing down. But yeah.
Is that just in how you're phrasing things, or what's the translation
how you're phrasing.
there?
Yeah, how you're phrasing, audience, and again, like narrative drives a lot of what we do. So it's not like I don't enjoy doing the like top 10 scariest monster thing where you're just like listing the qualities and maybe his stories. I really try to create some kind of narrative. And sometimes that's driven by like historical timeline, like we'll do things chronologically. Sometimes that's, going forward before we go back. It just kind of depends on the monster.
How long does your research normally take when you're looking into one?
It depends. And I think people think some of the more obscure monsters are the more challenging ones to research. And in some ways they are, if I'm having a hard time getting access to, text in English or something like that. And that's when I definitely bring in an expert to sort of give us some additional information. But a lot of the time, it's like the big name monsters that are actually more challenging because there's so much there. So something like werewolves, we had to do a multi-part series, or like zombies, we had to do 3 episodes on YouTube, and I got PBS to green light like an actual documentary about it. So I think those stories take months. I mean, it's really different, the process. I would say sometimes the research will take 3 days. Sometimes it might take 3 months, and anywhere in between.
Well, I must say your scripting is very well done, because it does feel like you build out the story very well. Like you flesh out the whole angle. You feel like you're really being brought into this world, into this scene.
Good, thank you. And that's sometimes one of the challenges that comes up with table read, or like when we're doing the scripting process, is I'm a great lover of what I call fun facts, of just like something that's maybe tangentially related. And I want to talk about it because I think it's cool or weird. And my team has to pull me back a little bit and be like, maybe we'll save this for a short, or like a social media post. Yeah, bring the scope in. But I think that has honestly made me a better professor and also a better researcher, even for some of my academic writing, right? Is like, okay, this thing is cool, but do I really need to be talking about it in this? No, not necessarily. That being said, I'm a big lover of a footnote when I do more traditional academic writing. Yeah.
Do you feel like doing this has kind of helped you hone out your lectures in class?
Absolutely. I think it's helped me, again, sort of decide what information is important. How do you drive all my classes are largely discussion based. So how can I get my students engaged in whatever we're talking about? Is a lot of it I try to like have make it a story. And that's obviously easier for literature classes, but even something like the rhetoric and composition, I teach a lot of first-year composition. If talking about the rhetorical appeals is boring in a lot of ways, but what if I teach them the most recent Super Bowl halftime show with those appeals and how visual symbolism is working in, with things like wardrobe and set design and dancing and the actual lyrics themselves, and making it something grounded in what they care about has definitely helped me be a better professor across the board.
And bring in those real world examples to kind of
Exactly.
really hone in on what you're trying to get to.
Yeah, or if I'm having them talk about a text that was like a poem written 400 years ago, how can I make that interesting or relevant to them today?
And adapt it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just fascinating that we, again, as we have progressed and especially as we've become more technological, these stories still just resonate with us. I'm a sucker for a good vampire movie or a good horror story. It Follows was a great movie, a really good horror movie. And in some ways it's weird. It almost feels like horror movies ebb and flow. Some years you'll get a couple great ones and then you'll have a dry spell for 5 or 6 years where they're just not really going in the same way that they used to.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is about like visibility in production as well, right? That I don't think we do have sort of trends in film with horror and even things like graphic novels and comics and more traditional literature as well. Anything, video games too, right? So I think for me, it's always happening. It's just who's paying attention to it at the time and who's getting the platform to sort of talk about those things. Because some of my favorite like slasher movies, for instance, are terrible ones that weren't really big. And I wouldn't necessarily say that like, yes, they're, worthy of some kind of award, but they're fun. And I do think recently that a lot of work from different kinds of horror creators across different genres has been getting more attention. Not just, I think that speaks to their talent, quite frankly, but I also think one of the reasons we're having not necessarily a horror revival, but it's becoming a little bit more visible and maybe more accepted, is because a lot of more people are getting to share their stories and their voice. We're having different kinds of creators and contributors behind the camera, behind the scripts. We're, allowing people to have platforms that maybe didn't get them before. And from historically, I firmly believe that some of the best stories, at least in terms of horror and monsters, come from voices that are traditionally silenced or not taken as seriously. And so when we do that, I think that's when we see some really interesting horror pop up.
Do you think some of that is attributed to the internet and these forums online or Reddit?
Yeah, I do think some of that is contributed to the internet and also just technology-wise. I mean, 28 years later is being filmed on like iPhones, right? Which is insane. And they clearly have the budget to not do that. But I think having something encouraging like that inspires a lot of creative minds out there. Even thinking of the creative things we had to do in Monstrum, but also horror creators had to do in 2020 with things like quarantine. And there was some really cool stuff that came out of that. And yeah, I do think that making things easier to produce and giving them this wider global platform because of the internet can be something that's really positive.
And with the dispersion of tools like that, you can have some really great films come up. I think Talk to Me, have you seen that one?
Yes.
That was a great one. And I think they were a fairly small production that created that one. And it was a great film.
Yeah, I don't think you need a big budget or a big production to make something really great, especially now with, the accessibility of a lot of tech and people can wear a lot of hats. And again, I think that has been happening for a long time. It's just becoming more visible or maybe more common now.
A little more mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that horror wasn't as approachable or as acceptable back in the day?
No, because I think that how horror and monsters were interpreted was in some ways different and similar to what we do now. So going back to something common like, let's say, a witch accusation, right? Is that would be something that was circulating in things like newspapers and in letters and being, shared orally and like scary stories to tell around the fire. So I do think we've always had this need and desire and perpetuation of horror in different ways. I just think that we see even something like Jack the Ripper or like the serial killer narrative really take hold in the 19th century and early 20th century when you start getting newspapers and that were cheaper and easier to produce and more people could read them. Frankly, more people could read, right? So when I think we have these physical things to connect to these stories, that makes them a little more popular.
I wonder what it's going to look like as VR starts to get better and you can really immerse yourself in maybe one of these movies or in a scene
Yeah.
and kind of have that disconnect fade where you're actually in the situation.
Yeah.
You're not just watching it.
I don't know if that's something I would even want to like
Might be a little
engage
intense.
with. I think
Yeah.
it'd be a little intense. And this is my philosophy, and might be exploring this season with the concept of the haunted house. So like traditionally how ghosts and spirits have been tied to physical places and the home, but also the idea of haunts is fascinating. That's essentially what a haunt is, right? Is you're going into a spooky location with actors and props and a story that's been designed to make you feel like you're in that moment. And I think that is fascinating. But I also think if we're thinking about that, we're also can think about something like public executions back in the day. Those were like a popular event, right? So we have always been towing the line with immersing ourselves in really horrific situations. And I think I always say that I can't do a haunt because I'm afraid I would get too into it and that, not allowed to like touch the actors. But if someone's going to grab me or come at me with what I think is a knife, I'm probably going to punch them in the face. So like for me, I don't think that experience would be great. I think I need the veil of fiction or, that
Some degree
screen
of
to separate
separation.
myself. Yep, just enough. Yeah.
So
But
you're
it's interesting.
So you're not a very big haunted house person, I take.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
No. I'm not. I never have been, which is really interesting. Maybe
you would
now
think that's
I'd
right
be
up
able
your
to.
alley.
Yeah, I think it's because, again, I go more into like fight mode or flight mode that to me it's not fun or enjoyable. I'll watch a good movie about it, like Hell House LLC is fantastic, right? Or the house that October built is great. I love reading those stories and watching those movies, but actually doing it myself. But in the same vein, I love reading undead literature and vampire stories. Do I want one of my loved ones popping up on my doorstep and like sucking my blood? Like, no, I don't. So I need the fiction element personally.
Yeah, you're more of a grab the go bag and get out. Let's leave this
Yes.
place.
Yes, definitely.
What do you think it says about us for those of us that do enjoy that, where we want that jump scare? We want to be immersed in that setting.
I don't know. I think that a lot of it comes from probably like personal experience and things that they've dealt with before, right? I think that a lot of the time, some of the more extreme haunts come from people who feel like they're having a lack of control, and so wanting to kind of see if they can do it to a degree and like have that confidence or that survival like aspect to it. And I think that there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, provided everyone's on the same page and it's done safely. But I would think it probably, I don't know, some of it's probably bragging rights, right? We see this a lot in like sea monsters, right? Like, don't get me wrong, giant squid are absolutely terrifying. Do I think that they were, taking down ships back in the day? No, but I think that was a cooler story to tell from, someone who maybe saw one kind of floating at the surface and got freaked out by it. So I do think there's part of that storytelling aspect that we want it to be bigger and scarier so that we can say that, well, I survived it or I did, the thing.
Well, and humans definitely love to embellish.
Yes.
I mean, we're no strangers to that.
No, we certainly do. And again, I can't, do anything, but I mean, again, I studied literature. So that's where I think good stories come from. So in some ways, I think that I appreciate that. But I do think in some ways that can be dangerous, right? Especially if they're connected to real life consequences. So again, going back to werewolves, like killing entire wolf populations in countries in Europe because they were so freaked out by werewolves and frankly just wolves hurting livestock in general. And of course, there are human instances where real people were injured or even killed because of some kind of negative story that was told about them connected to monstrosity. So I do think it's a fine line. We have to be careful and be responsible about it. And that's one of the things that drives my research is I hope that by presenting maybe why some of these monsters were created, that ideally we could maybe see when they're trying to be created or trying to demonize certain people in our current society.
Do you think we're better at that today? No. That's not comforting.
I know. And again, it's probably weird coming from the optimist that I was just talking about earlier in this interview, but I think I shouldn't say firm no. I've definitely seen things in the classroom and even in like horror communities and places like cons, and that I do think, especially younger generations, I think are a little bit more willing to accept more different opinions and like identities and just things going on. I think there's a little bit more of that responsibility. But again, I think unfortunately, the way our news system and pop culture system and all those things, that's the negative side, right, of the internet and accessibility of technology, is that anyone can kind of pop up and say something, and it's getting harder and harder to tell if those things are real. So as someone who is a public figure, I get nervous about things like deep fakes. I'm knock on wood, I don't think there are any out there that I'm aware of, but who's to say that someone's not going to create something that paints me in a really negative light that's not true? And I think, again, unless you're taught good like media literacy, that you maybe are more willing to accept those things. But again, that also, I would probably say that a couple hundred years ago too. I think it's definitely a spectrum. So hopefully we'll move in a more positive direction. But I think unfortunately, that's, like I said, part of the reason we've always made monsters is because not just for entertainment, but for some kind of lesson or warning. And again, I wish we could be more responsible about that, but I'm not sure if we are.
That idea of deepfakes is kind of an interesting one. Is that a fear that you think a lot of public-facing academics have? Is the worry that
I think, or creators or whatever. Yeah. I mean, when we have, like summits and stuff, even with PBS, and we're learning about all these things and things like voices that can be used, it is a little terrifying. I mean, I think that is a risk that you take of being a public figure, especially in this day and age. I think it's always been a risk, but yeah, the ability that lots of people have to sort of misinterpret things or paint in a certain way is scary. But luckily enough that, at least so far, like I was saying, I largely positive comments and those things haven't really happened. But I think that's kind of the risk that you take for sure.
And especially as your body of work grows, as you have 7 seasons, as you have 100 episodes, there's more to pull from.
Absolutely. But I think part of that is also just being really true to yourself, and not allowing yourself to be manipulated by outside forces. So I know, I'm not going to name any names, I have done interviews for things before where I was not actually used in the final product because like I wouldn't say something. I wouldn't conclusively say like, oh yes, this proves the existence of X, Y, or Z. Because for me, that's part of being responsible is I'm not going to do it. But also part of that is protecting my own identity and my sort of brand.
And that touches back on the brand idea that you brought up at the beginning, where that's kind of really what you have. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, I think that sometimes that's something that is more negative. And I think, again, it takes away maybe some of the allure of what I do as like a professor and an academic. But I think that practically, especially as we are engaging with students and audiences who are increasingly media literate and who sort of expect a different kind of education and teaching than we were doing, 20 years ago, 200 years ago, I see it as part of our job as a modern scholar to evolve with my students, even if that means doing some things that are a little non-traditional.
Okay, well, Emily, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me.
Thank you so much. This was so great. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for having me.
Do you have anything you want to plug where people can find Monstrum, your other work?
Yeah, so you can find Monstrum on YouTube with PBS's History Channel, also on pbs.org and the PBS app. You can find more about me on dremilyzarka.com, and I have all my projects and stuff listed there. So check it out and feel free to reach out.